11.7 billion pounds of apples are produced in the United States every single year, an amount so massive it fills endless warehouses, floods supply chains, and dominates supermarket shelves across the country. Yet hidden behind this scale is a reality that almost no one talks about, because every year over 350 million pounds of those apples are never eaten, never shipped, never even leave the orchard. They are left hanging, dropped, or abandoned to rot where they were grown. Not because they are poisoned, not because they are unsafe, but because someone made a calculated decision that harvesting them would be a mistake. And that decision is not rare. It is built directly into the system, because in this industry, growing more does not guarantee earning more. In fact, producing too much can destroy profits faster than producing too little, which creates a paradox that defines the entire apple economy, where farmers are pushed to maximize output using some of the most advanced agricultural systems in the world, while simultaneously preparing to throw a large portion of that output away. And this is not a failure of technology, because modern apple farming is one of the most optimized biological production systems ever created, with engineered trees, precision irrigation, controlled pollination, and industrial-scale harvesting methods, all designed to extract the highest possible yield from every acre of land. Yet even with all of this control, the final outcome is not determined by how many apples are grown, but by how many apples are worth picking, because the moment market prices drop below the cost of harvesting, every additional apple becomes a liability instead of an asset, meaning that leaving fruit to rot can actually be the smarter financial move. And that is where the system reveals its true nature. This is not simply farming. It is a high-stakes production game where every decision is tied to cost, timing, and market demand, and where the wrong move at the wrong time can turn an entire season of work into a guaranteed loss, which is why farmers are forced to think differently from what most people expect. Because their goal is not to grow as much food as possible. Their goal is to grow only what can be sold at a profit. And anything beyond that threshold becomes expendable, even if it looks perfect, even if it is fully edible, and even if it represents months of labor, water, and resources. All of it can be sacrificed in a single decision. And to understand how a system like this even exists, you have to go back to the very beginning. Long before the apples appear on trees, before harvest, before markets, to the moment where this entire process starts. Because what looks like a simple orchard is actually the foundation of a massive, long-term investment, one that takes years to build, demands constant precision, and operates under pressure from forces that cannot be fully controlled. And once it begins, there is no easy way out. Because every tree planted locks farmers into a cycle that will determine not only how much they produce, but whether that production will ever be worth anything at all, long before a single apple appears on a branch. The entire outcome of the harvest is already being decided, because planting an orchard is not a seasonal activity. It is a long-term commitment that can lock a farmer into a fixed system for the next 10 to 20 years. And once the first tree goes into the ground, there is no quick way to adjust, no reset button, no easy exit, which means every decision at the beginning carries long-term financial consequences. Because a newly planted apple tree will not produce any commercial fruit for at least 3 to 5 years. And in some cases, it can take nearly a decade before it reaches peak production. During that time, the farmer is continuously investing money into land preparation, irrigation systems, fertilizers, labor, and maintenance without receiving any return, turning the early phase into a high-risk capital investment rather than a farming activity. And this is where modern apple production separates itself from traditional agriculture. Because these orchards are not planted randomly, they are engineered systems designed for maximum output, starting with one of the most important techniques in the entire industry, grafting, a process that allows farmers to build each tree as a controlled biological machine by combining two separate parts, the rootstock and the scion, where the rootstock acts as the foundation that determines how large the tree will grow, how resistant it is to cold, and how efficiently it absorbs water and nutrients, while the scion is the upper portion responsible for producing the exact variety of apple that will be sold on the market, meaning that every tree in a commercial orchard is not naturally grown, but intentionally assembled to deliver predictable results. And this level of control allows farmers to push density to extreme levels, because instead of widely spaced traditional trees, modern orchards pack between 1,800 and 2,000 trees into a single acre, transforming the land into a tightly managed production grid where every meter is optimized for yield. But this density introduces a new layer of pressure, because when trees are planted this close together, there is no margin for uncontrolled growth, no space for natural spreading, and no tolerance for inefficiency, which is why from the very beginning, each tree is trained into a specific structure using support systems that resemble industrial frameworks more than natural landscapes. Vertical stakes are installed alongside every tree, and horizontal trellis wires are stretched across entire rows, forcing the trees to grow in narrow, upright forms that maximize sunlight exposure and allow machines and workers to move efficiently through the orchard. And this structure is not optional, because without it, trees would collapse under their own future weight once they begin producing large volumes of fruit. Meaning that even before the first apple forms, the orchard is already being prepared to handle tons of output per acre. And every element in this setup is designed with a single objective: to eliminate unpredictability and convert a natural process into a controlled production system. But this level of control comes at a cost, because the more optimized the system becomes, the less tolerant it is to error. And from this point forward, every stage of growth must be carefully managed, because once the trees are established, they begin demanding resources at a scale that cannot be handled manually. And this is where the operation shifts from setup to continuous management, where even a small miscalculation can reduce quality, lower market value, and push the entire harvest closer to becoming part of the millions of pounds that will never be picked. Once the orchard is fully established, the system enters its most demanding phase, where every tree begins operating like a high-consumption biological machine, continuously pulling in resources and converting them into potential profit. But only if every variable is controlled with precision, because at this stage, even small inefficiencies can cascade into large-scale losses across thousands of trees. And the first pressure point appears immediately with water, because each developing apple requires a steady and significant supply every single week. And when multiplied across an orchard packed with up to 2,000 trees per acre, manual watering becomes completely impossible, forcing farmers to rely on advanced drip irrigation systems that deliver water directly to the root zone of each tree with extreme accuracy, controlling not only the volume but also the timing to match the exact growth stage of the fruit, because too little water slows development and reduces fruit size, while too much water dilutes sugar concentration and lowers overall quality. Since commercial value depends heavily on size, color, and sweetness, even a slight imbalance can downgrade entire batches from premium pricing to lower-tier markets. And this is where the system starts revealing its fragility, because maximum efficiency also means minimum tolerance for error, and water is only one part of the equation. As the next critical control process is pruning, which is not a cosmetic task but a strategic intervention that directly determines how energy flows through the tree. Because without pruning, the tree will grow dense and chaotic, blocking sunlight from reaching inner branches and creating uneven fruit development, so farmers must aggressively remove branches, shaping each tree into an open structure that allows light to penetrate evenly, ensuring that every apple receives enough exposure to develop the color and sugar levels required by commercial standards. But this process carries its own risks, because every cut is effectively an open wound, and timing becomes critical, since pruning must be done when temperatures are safely above freezing, because if the temperature drops too low, those cuts can trigger internal damage that spreads backward into the tree, killing branches and permanently reducing productivity for future seasons, meaning that a single poorly timed pruning session can affect not just one harvest, but multiple years of output. And this is what defines the system at this level: a constant balancing act between pushing the trees to produce as much as possible while avoiding conditions that could destabilize the entire structure. Because the closer the system moves toward peak efficiency, the more sensitive it becomes to environmental fluctuations. And this sensitivity extends beyond water and structure into the broader challenge of maintaining consistent growth under changing weather conditions, where heat waves, unexpected cold snaps, or irregular rainfall can disrupt carefully calibrated inputs, forcing farmers to react quickly to prevent losses. And all of this happens before the fruit has even fully developed, meaning that by the time apples begin to form in large numbers, the system has already passed through multiple points where failure could have reduced or even destroyed the potential yield. And yet, even if everything goes perfectly up to this stage, the next phase introduces a completely different kind of problem, because success itself becomes a threat. As the trees begin producing more fruit than they can physically support, setting up the next critical decision where farmers must actively reduce their own production in order to protect what remains valuable. As the trees move from controlled growth into full production, the system reaches a point where nature takes over in a way that no machine can replace. Because without pollination, none of the previous effort matters. And this is where the entire operation becomes dependent on a living workforce that farmers do not directly control. Bees, millions of them, transported across states and deployed into orchards with a single mission: transfer pollen between flowers to trigger fruit development. Because most commercial apple varieties cannot self-pollinate, meaning that without this biological process, the trees will bloom but never produce apples, turning an entire season into zero output. And this dependency creates another layer of cost and risk, as farmers must rent beehives at industrial scale, carefully timing their arrival to match the narrow flowering window. Because if the bees arrive too early or too late, pollination rates drop, and with them, the total yield. So once again, timing becomes critical. But when everything goes right, when the weather is stable, the bees are active, and pollination is successful, the trees respond with maximum output, producing far more fruit than they can sustain. And this is where the system flips, because what looks like success immediately becomes a structural threat. As hundreds or even thousands of small apples begin forming on each tree, far exceeding what the branches can physically support, and if all of these fruits are allowed to grow, the weight alone can snap branches, permanently damaging the tree and reducing future productivity, while also producing smaller, lower quality apples that fail to meet market standards, which forces farmers into one of the most counterintuitive actions in the entire process. They must deliberately destroy a large portion of their own crop, and this step, known as thinning, is not optional, it is essential. Because leaving too many apples on the tree spreads resources too thin, resulting in fruit that is too small, it's poorly colored, and commercially undesirable. So workers move through the orchard, removing apples by hand or using chemical thinning agents, reducing clusters down to a single fruit and maintaining precise spacing between them, often around a few inches apart, ensuring that the remaining apples receive enough nutrients, sunlight, and space to grow to premium size and quality. And this process can eliminate a significant percentage of the initial fruit set, meaning that long before harvest, a large portion of potential production has already been intentionally removed. And this is where the logic of the system becomes clear, because maximizing output does not mean keeping everything. It means selecting only what can achieve the highest value, and everything else becomes expendable, even if it looks healthy. Even if it could technically be sold, because in a market driven by appearance and consistency, anything below the standard drags down the overall price. So farmers are constantly making decisions about what to keep and what to eliminate, shaping the final harvest months before it actually happens. And this mindset carries forward into the next stage, where the remaining apples must be collected with extreme care. Because after all the investment, control, and reduction, a single mistake during harvest can still destroy the value that has been built throughout the entire season when harvest season begins. Everything built over the past several years compresses into a narrow window where speed, precision, and costs all collide at once, because apples cannot wait indefinitely on the tree. And every day delayed increases the risk of overripening, whether damage or falling market prices, forcing farmers to move fast while still protecting the fragile value of each fruit. And this is where the operation hits its human limit. Because harvesting apples for the fresh market is still one of the few stages where machines cannot fully replace human hands. Since each apple must be picked without bruising, without tearing the stem, and without damaging surrounding fruit, requiring workers to use a controlled motion, lifting or twisting the apple gently to detach it cleanly, and repeating this thousands of times per day with consistent accuracy and to meet industrial-scale demands. Farms rely heavily on migrant labor forces, assembling large crews that can move through orchards efficiently. It's often working long hours to keep up with the pace required, but this precision comes at a cost, because labor is expensive, time is limited, and productivity has a ceiling, which creates pressure to increase efficiency, leading to the introduction of semi-mechanized systems, where mobile platforms lift workers to higher branches and conveyor belts transport harvested apples directly into bins, reducing movement time and increasing output per worker, pushing productivity higher but still tied to human speed. And this is where full mechanization begins to take over in segments of the industry where appearance is less critical. Because for apples destined for processing, speed matters more than perfection, allowing machines to operate without the same level of care. And this shift unlocks a completely different scale of harvesting, where shaker machines clamp onto tree trunks and generate intense vibrations that strip fruit from branches within seconds, dropping them onto the ground or collection systems below, followed by over-row harvesters that move continuously along rows, engulfing entire sections of orchard and using rotating mechanisms to dislodge apples at high speed, achieving harvesting rates of multiple tons per hour, far beyond what any human team can match. And on top of this, emerging robotic systems equipped with cameras and sensors are being developed to identify and pick fruit automatically, signaling a future where labor constraints are further reduced and production capacity increases even more. But this is where the system reaches its breaking point, because despite all this capability to produce and harvest at massive scale, the final outcome is not determined by how much can be collected, but by how much can be sold at a profit. And when supply surges beyond market demand, prices begin to drop, sometimes rapidly, and as prices fall, a critical threshold is crossed, where the revenue generated from selling apples no longer covers the combined costs of harvesting, transporting, and packing them. And at that moment, every additional apple harvested creates a direct financial loss instead of profit, turning the act of harvesting itself into a risk. And this is the point where the most extreme decision in the entire system is made, because farmers must choose between harvesting at a guaranteed loss or leaving the fruit where it is. And in many cases, the numbers are clear. It is cheaper to do nothing, cheaper to walk away, cheaper to let entire sections of orchard go untouched. Even after months of investment, labor, and resource consumption, and this is not an exception. It is a recurring outcome in years of oversupply, which is why hundreds of millions of pounds of apples are left to rot each year, not because they lack quality, not because they cannot be eaten, but because they no longer have economic value. And this is the true climax of the system, where maximum production collides with market reality, and the final decision is no longer about growing food, but about minimizing loss in a system where success can produce more than the market is willing to absorb for the apples that do make it past this brutal selection process. Their journey continues into a system that is just as controlled and optimized as the orchard itself. Because once harvested, every second matters in preserving quality, and the first step is transportation, where apples are often moved using water channels that cushion their movement and reduce impact damage, allowing massive volumes to flow through the facility without bruising, immediately followed by a multi-stage cleaning process that removes dirt, bacteria, and chemical residues using recirculated water baths and high-pressure sprays, preparing the fruit for its most critical checkpoint, automated sorting, where advanced camera systems scan each apple at high speed, analyzing color, size, surface defects, and weight with precision far beyond human capability, processing thousands of apples per hour and instantly classifying them into different quality grades, because in this system, not all apples are equal, and their final destination depends entirely on how they are ranked at this stage, with top-tier apples moving forward as premium fresh products, while lower-grade ones are redirected into processing lines. But even the highest quality apples are not ready for market yet, because after washing and sorting, they are coated with a thin layer of food-grade wax to replace the natural protective layer lost during cleaning, locking in moisture and enhancing appearance, ensuring that the apples can survive long distribution chains while still looking fresh on store shelves. And for those not immediately sold, storage becomes the next critical phase, where controlled atmosphere rooms drastically reduce oxygen levels to slow down respiration, effectively placing the apples into a state of artificial dormancy that can preserve freshness for months without significant loss of quality, allowing producers to release supply gradually and avoid flooding the market all at once. But even with this level of control, not every apple is destined for direct consumption, because a large portion is intentionally diverted into processing industries where appearance no longer matters. And this is where the system reveals its final layer of efficiency. Because apples that fail visual standards are crushed into pulp and processed, into juice using industrial presses that extract liquid at scale, followed by pasteurization to ensure safety and stability, then packaged for distribution, while another portion is used in cider production, where fermentation transforms the juice over days or weeks into alcoholic beverages, adding value through chemical conversion rather than visual perfection. And even after juice extraction, the remaining solid material, known as pumice, is not discarded but repurposed into livestock feed, organic fertilizer, or raw material for other industries, ensuring that nearly every part of the apple is utilized in some form. And this creates the impression of a zero-waste system, where nothing is truly lost, only redirected into different value streams. But this final efficiency does not change the core reality that defines the entire process, because long before apples reach these facilities, before they are sorted, processed, or stored, a significant portion has already been excluded, left behind in orchards because they failed to meet one simple condition: being worth the cost of harvesting. And this is the defining truth of the system. That value is not determined by whether food exists, but by whether it can be profitably moved through the chain, which means that what looks like waste from the outside is actually a built-in filter inside the system, separating what will be sold from what will be ignored. And in the end, the apple in your hand is not just the result of nature or farming skill. It is the outcome of a long series of decisions, calculations, and eliminations, where only a fraction of what is grown is allowed to reach you, and everything else, no matter how edible or abundant, is simply left behind because in this system, usefulness is not enough. Only profitability decides what survives.